Hi, everyone. This is Doc T with another episode of the Horse Advocate podcast. I'm doing another podcast that is reviewing several presentations at the 2021 American Association Equine Practitioners Conference that I attended virtually and took notes on. And this was under the Therapeutics, Safety, and Side Effects, which I thought was fairly interesting. There was 4 different topics here. The first was combining butorphenol and detomidine for the endoscopic assessment of laryngeal function of thoroughbred yearlings. And I'll get into what each one of these means. I'm just going to read them now. Subclinical colitis following nonsteroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. CBD in horses, just a general review. And then CBD effects on sedation, ataxia, and health in horses. So that's what we're going to cover today. It's going to be a little bit boring. I really apologize for that. Medicine can be very boring, especially when some of the scientific journals are trying desperately to come up with solutions or better understanding of the use of therapeutics when there really isn't much money that's available to do these studies full bore. Full bore, what I mean by that is that there are enough horses in the study that it lasts long enough that they can really dig in to understand some of these things. That's because there's so much individual variation between horses that a drug in one horse may not have the same effect as a drug in the other horse. I'm sure most of you, if you've taken any sort of medication, anything from an aspirin to a powerful sedative, one person will say, that stuff worked great. The other person said, I threw up the whole time. A third person will say, I had no effect from that at all. So it all depends on how we genetically are wired to make these things work. So with that caveat in mind, let's go over these 4 things. The first was the combination of butorphenol, which is normally known as torbigesic, and detomidine, which is dormocidine. And they took horses that were only yearlings, just thoroughbreds. So right away, we have 2 biases. First, a breed bias. Thoroughbred, we all know is going to be a little bit different in the mind than, let's say, a draft horse or a gaited horse or any other horse that you might can think of right away, a pony even. Second is that they're all yearlings. So this has no bearing on older horses. So they're looking at laryngeal function and symmetry. And basically, you all have heard of roaring. And roaring is when the horse is put through an exertion and the folds, there are 2 folds that block the trachea or the airway, and those folds create the voice. They're vocal folds. They just come across a block and they fold away, kind of like a curtain on stage. When the curtains are drawn back, the performers can perform and the curtains close and you don't see what's behind the curtains. In horses, the left side of the larynx can sometimes not fold back all the way. So part of the stage is blocked and the wind that blows through the airway will cause it to flutter and create a sound. And what's really fascinating is how this works. The brain has a set of nerves that go directly to the larynx and innervates them. That innervation is divided between the left and the right halves. So in the right recurrent laryngeal nerve, it goes straightly from the brain to the larynx, to the fold. And when it's triggered, it's pulled back to open up. And when it's relaxed, it comes back in, or vice versa. I'm not too sure which is I think it has to be triggered to come back. That could be the relaxed state too. I don't know. Don't hold me to it. That's not the point here. The real point is the nerve goes directly from the brain straight to the larynx. So it's a nice short trip. But in the left recurrent laryngeal, that nerve, through just physical development of the embryo, has to travel all the way down the jugular groove, all the way down to the heart, and has to circle around the aortic, the aorta. It's part of the aorta, but anyway, the major vessel of the heart. And then it has to come all the way back up the throat, the neck, all the way to the throat and attach to the left laryngeal, or to the left larynx. So when you have a firing of the nerve, that signal goes down and has to travel further on the left and come all the way back up to get to the muscle to cause it to contract. And because electricity moves so fast, the timing of that is infinitesimally different. So we don't actually see a problem. However, in some horses, over time, especially with exertion, that transmission of the nerve can be reduced. So you have a failing of the larynx to completely retract in the open position, and it fails, it becomes exhausted and stays in the closed position and flaps, and that's where roaring comes from. That's why it's always on the left side. And what these researchers wanted to do is look at yearlings, because one of the things they do at the yearling sales is they scope these horses to see if there's a problem with this laryngeal fold back. And it's very difficult to shove an endoscope up a nose of a yearling with complete, what's the word I'm thinking of? Acceptance. The horse says, sure, go ahead, shove it up my nose, we'll be fine. And that doesn't always happen. So they end up putting a twitch on the horse. And by twitching the nose, they apply some physical pain that decreases the sensation of the tube going in there. And then they can look and see if this fold or lack of symmetry is occurring. And they wanted to see if adding butorphenol to detomidine plus 5 minutes would affect that the same as twitching. So they wanted to know, can we medicate these horses, or do we just have to twitch them to have it happen? And what they found was, after the medication, there was no statistical significance between the sedated and the non-sedated horses. In other words, everything pretty much looked the same. So that was the goal of the study. They wanted to make sure that they could drug these horses and get the same results without it. One of the surprising things was that in 50% of the sedated horses, a defect called dorsal pharyngeal collapse, they could see in these horses that they could not see in the twitch. So they're looking for laryngeal symmetry, and they found that, and they found that that was the same. And oh, by the way, in half the horses that are medicated, now we have this dorsal pharyngeal collapse. And is that significant in these horses? Is that something that we should be concerned about? Is that normal in sedated horses, but has no effect on their racing career? So many questions were raised, and it makes this study a fascinating one, because while they didn't have very many horses, I think they had 46 thoroughbred yearlings. And because it's just thoroughbreds and just yearlings, we have a lot of more questions to ask. And I know that this has been looked at a billion times. I remember back in the 1980s, there was a veterinarian, I believe he became the dean of the vet school at Tufts University, who's well known for looking at the laryngeal function and using medications or not using medications. And I believe he said that you're going to see a lot more issues with medications. So this isn't something that is new that they're looking at. So they're trying to target one specific group, which are yearlings at the thoroughbred sales that are scoped all the time for laryngeal function. And they want to know if they could just do it with a twitch or with drugging, because a lot of these horses need to be medicated to do a lot of things, not just scoping. And they thought that this would be significant. So it was, in a way, and then it also opened up a can of worms. So that was the first presentation. The next one was a review of how the COX, which stands for a pathway of pain, that occurs in, I think, all mammals. I know it happens in humans and in horses. And they have the COX-1 and the COX-2, COX is how you spell that. And this was a subclinical colitis following nonsteroidal anti-inflammatories, which includes Banamine, Bute, and what I call Equioxx, because that's the brand name. And I always have trouble with this. It's just one of my things, but firocoxib is the drug name. So they looked at this and they did a review of the COX-1 and the COX-2 pathways that both come from arachidonic acid, which is basically a fat. And these fats go down the COX-1 pathway, and they create something called PGE2, and that causes pain, fever, and bone formation, basically inflammation. Whereas the COX-2 goes down to two different pathways, the PG1-2, which goes to gastroprotection, or how the lining of the gut is protected, and normalization or hemostasis of the kidneys. And the second pathway is the TXA2. It's irrelevant what these all mean. You guys aren't, veterinarians trying to remember all the ins and outs of science. That goes to platelet function and contraction of vessels. And the nonsteroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, they block both COX-1 and COX-2. So they're covering the whole pathway. So in other words, it's blocking pain, it's reducing fever, but it's also reducing the protection that these acids, these fats actually do for the GI tract and for the kidneys. And it's been well known for a long time that if you give nonsteroidal anti-inflammatories for a long time, you can actually cause ulceration of the gut, especially in the cecum, and also you can destroy kidneys. So this is why we don't give nonsteroidal anti-inflammatories for a long period of time without monitoring some of the functions that are going on. And they wanted to look at the firocoxib or Equioxx, which only affects the COX-1 pathway and doesn't affect the COX-2, which is why it's so important, a drug in removing pain and fever in horses, because it's not supposed to cause the gastrointestinal or the kidney problems. So the question was, will this decrease colonic ulceration? So the study went on and did two treatments. One treatment was IV Banamine. Banamine, flunix, and meglumine is a very common anti-inflammatory that's in the NA, non-steroidal anti-inflammatories. And they added to that omeprazole. And omeprazole is basically a protectant of the gastric mucosa to prevent anything that might be happening in the stomach. In the second treatment, they took the same horses after they had a 6-month washout, which is really important to have a washout, but there's no real studies to show how long a washout needs to be. So they picked 6 months, which I think seems reasonable to most people. And then they went to, instead of twice a day intravenous Banamine, they did once a day oral firocoxib, and the omeprazole. And they looked at the colon wall thickness. And what was interesting was the thickness actually increased in the Equioxx versus the Banamine. They also looked at total serum protein. It increased in the Equioxx, but decreased the total serum protein in Banamine. So decrease usually means colitis, but not edema. So we have increased thickness, but we don't have signs of colitis in these horses. So right away, we're getting a big question mark. There's an increase in creatine, I can never pronounce that right, creatine, which is an indicator of kidney function, but there's no change in the blood urea nitrogen, which is also an indication that there could be some inflammation in the kidneys. They did notice that there's a tremendous decrease in phosphorus with Equioxx, but not with Banamine. So what does this all mean? you're just scratching your head, you're mucking your stall, driving and saying, Doc, all I do is, muck stalls for a living. I want to know a little bit more about horses. I really don't know what all this means. So let's get to the bottom line. The results were there's increased subclinical colon inflammation with the Equioxx. I mean, that just has to be said. So here we are giving Equioxx, thinking that we're not affecting the colon and we're decreasing pain, and that should be good. But the results showed that there's increased subclinical colon inflammation, and we don't really want that. Now, that's compared to the Banamine, but we used different routes. One used IV and the other used oral. And we also had selection bias, small size, different routes, unblinded ultrasonographer. So the guy who was actually ultrasounding the thickness of the colon, he knew which group of horses he was doing. I mean, they were doing him once, and then 6 months later, they're doing him again. And so he actually knew. So the bottom line was, quote, we really don't understand how the Cox system works. That's always tough, because here we are trying to test something that we don't even know how it works. And we do end up adding questions. I will add to this that Texas A&M vet school years ago flushed out the mouth of the horse, and through fancy science, they were able to identify through DNA testing the various individual species of bacteria that are living inside the horse's mouth. Remember, what's inside your mouth is outside your body, and it is just the opening to the long tube that runs through your body. It's not in your body. And what's in your mouth is filled with these normal bacteria that maintain the health of the teeth, the gums, the cheeks, all of that. And oftentimes we can change that through high sugar diets. They knew that back in 1932, I think it was, in Brooklyn. They realized that dental caries, or what you and I call cavities, came from, these things. They came from the diet that children were eating, and they removed the sugar. Specifically, they removed oatmeal from their diet. And when they did, that diet removed the dental caries in these children. So we know that the diet can affect things. And what they found, Texas A&M found, was that Equioxx, one dose of Equioxx would kill a whole family of bacteria inside the horse's mouth. So anytime you give these non-steroidal anti-inflammatories, it's great to measure the thickness of the gut wall and these liver enzymes and kidney enzymes and all these functions. I get it. But we also need to be looking at the gut microbiome and how these drugs are affecting them. And how long does it affect them? Do we replace those bacteria with bad bacteria? What are some of the other causes? And I find that most science at best is limiting. And because we don't have a lot of money to study these horses and do enough studies in enough horses in a big enough size, that we come up with some really screwy results. And this is one of those results where, well, do I continue to give Equioxx over Banamine for gut, protection and as well as pain? And I don't think we actually have an answer. I try to avoid all of them, all the non-steroidal anti-inflammatories, unless absolutely needed. I know in my life, I love them when needed, but I don't take them every day. Unless you absolutely can't function, then you have to, and then you have to pay attention to the gut microbiome. All right, the third and fourth one is about CBD, and this is what everybody wants to know about, because CBD is a big thing in humans. I know that THC, which is the psychotropic part that is in marijuana, there's all sorts of studies of that being used in humans. There's tons of money for that. It's been legalized in so many states. Now that hemp has been legalized several years ago here in America, we now are getting CBD products, which is by definition less than 0.3% THC. So there should be no psychotropic activities in CBDC that's sold over the counter. There's one drug called, how do they name drugs so funny? Epidiolex, something like that. It's FDA approved in humans for epilepsy. It has bioavailability in horses. In other species, it's used for behavior changes, arthritis, seizures, and a new word for me, allodynia. And allodynia is a condition in which pain is caused by a stimulus that does not normally elicit pain. They used 12 horses in the study, and already you know that that's not enough. They gave 2% body weight in hay and 1 pound of grain 1 hour prior to dosing. And you know my feelings about grain and the inflammation that it causes. So I'm not a big fan of grain in horses, but that's what they did. They wanted to make sure that there was a meal in there because apparently there's an increase in bioavailability of CBD in horses after a high-fat meal. And the CBD was in oil. Now, the results were there's no behavior or health issues. Well, that's good. Most of us who have used CBD in horses, I haven't, but I've heard enough people who have said that there's no problems. There's no bad side effects. Most of the horses had elevated liver enzymes, but they all equilibrated at the end of the study. And they all also had hypocalcemia, which means the blood levels of calcium dropped. They did notice that the CBD was dose dependent, and the half-life normalizes at about 6 weeks for both doses. And in the synovial joint, it was evident at 12 hours, but gone at 24 hours. So if you're giving CBD for joint pain, it's pretty much gone, and you have to dose them every day. So the takeaways were the doses that they used were variable for the individual. It caused they got low plasma concentrations. Now, they also did this in guinea pigs. Apparently somebody else did, and they found the same results. Both guinea pigs are hindgut fermenters, as are horses. So they were wondering if that had something to do with it, because this is basically from hemp. So dose 4 hours before you have to give it 4 hours before the desired effect. So if you wanted this for behavioral change, you'll have to be 4 hours ahead of that. So if you're going to be shipping your horse or doing something with it, you want to give it 4 hours beforehand. If it's just for routine lameness or pain in the joints, you can just give it and know that it's going to take about 4 hours before you have an effect. It's not immediate. It will increase calcium in the blood, but ionized calcium was normal. So that's good. We want ionized calcium. That's what we use for muscle contraction, et cetera. The liver enzymes did increase, and those are not dose dependent, but the plasma levels are dose dependent. So, okay, so what am I saying here? Let's boil this right down. And I love the way they put this. We had a small size, 12 horses in the study. There was a single formulation, so they didn't try different formulations. And the cost for the formulation was either $30 or $90 per day. And who has $30 to $90 per day to give FDA approved CBD oil to your horse? Not too many. That's pretty expensive. So a lot of people are falling back to non-verified CBD that they get at a local store. You aren't too sure of exactly what's in there. There's no FDA regulation of what's in there. That's the biggest takeaway. Second, you may have to use more for a large horse, obviously less for a pony or a mini. It could be helpful, but it really isn't. So is it worth the expense? And of course, every one of you listening to this is say, I'm not going to spend $30 to $90 every day of my horse's life, because the half-life is 24 hours, to decrease pain when bute's a lot cheaper. It just doesn't make sense. But we have to do these studies. And again, we have to use FDA approved drugs, because that means that what's in the bottle is actually getting in the horse. When you buy CBD off the shelf at the local convenience store, it could be a total ripoff. You have no guarantees of what's in there. That's just human nature, right? Now, the fourth study was CBD effects on sedation, ataxia, health. And there are many adverse effects in humans, according to this person. You have increased liver enzymes, and that's important because if you also are drinking alcohol or you have non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, as 44% of most Americans, and that number keeps increasing every year, have non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. That's why liver transplants are rejected. Donors are rejected because their livers are shot, and they can be shot at 20 and 30 years of age in humans. So liver disease, liver enzymes are really important to normalize. You can also have increased gastrointestinal disturbances and increased nervous system disorders, as amongst other things. This is in humans with CBD. So they took horses that were confined for 56 days, and they gave CBD from hemp, and they looked at sedation and ataxia score 2 hours post-treatment. They used 20 thoroughbred geldings. So they didn't even go to stallions or mares. They just used geldings. And one of those 20 had acute neuroscience and was euthanized, diagnosed with EPM. So they only used this in 19 horses. So again, the size number is small. It's only geldings, and it's only thoroughbreds. So they scored sedation as 0 was none and 3 was deep, or is what we call in the field schnockered. Ataxia was 0, none, and 5 was recumbent. They were flat out the stuff. And without getting into the exact numbers of what they scored, there was absolutely no significant difference between those that were giving nothing and giving this dose of once a day CBD. No significant difference between sedation or ataxia. So the dose they gave was 150 milligrams, which is 0.3 milligrams for a kilogram body weight, which was available at the time. Now, what was interesting is in the previous study that I talked about CBD use, they used 1 milligram per kilogram, which is $30 a day, and 3 milligrams per kilogram, which is $90 a day. So this is 0.3 milligrams. So we're talking 1/10. So that's still $9 per day for this dose. And there's just nothing coming out of this that tells me anything other than if you're purchasing FDA approved CBD for humans and giving it to your horse, you should be contributing that money to a better cause. That's how I look at it. So that is the therapeutic safety and side effect for presentation of the American Association of Equine Practitioners. This is a short podcast because there really is nothing else to say. I might just add a commentary here. These are really good people trying to do the best they can to understand certain things that people are asking about. You know, is Equioxx doing a good job? Should I be using CBD oil in my horses? What about doing scoping in yearlings? And they're basically trying to answer questions with little funding and little few number of horses that are select for an individual group, like geldings or thoroughbreds or yearlings. And this is the major problem with science in horses. Science in humans, in human studies, has tons of money available through the National Institute of Health, the NIH, government funding, and people make a living off these. They're scientists for their whole life, for decades. And that's a path that a lot of people take, research. They're medical doctors, MDs, or they're DVMs, and they try to move forward with an idea, a hypothesis, a guess. And they try to prove wrong their hypothesis in every way, shape that they can. And if they prove it wrong, then they reassemble and get a new hypothesis and test that until they find a hypothesis cannot be proven wrong. And then that hypothesis becomes a theory. I read the book on Otto Warburg. I think I've talked about this before. The book is called Ravenous, and he studied how the mitochondria worked inside cells back in the 1920s and 1930s. And I think in 1932, it was a pretty productive year, they found that there's something called mitochondrial flexibility. He didn't call it that, but he realized that the mitochondria uses glucose and fat for fuel, and that people with high glucose diets, high sugar diets, actually will have more resistance to using fat, so they become inflexible, and this leads to cancer. So he spent his whole life working hard at it. He met obstacles such as Hitler, the Third Reich, him being Jew and a practicing homosexual. He should have been just shot, hung, gassed, whatever Hitler wanted to do with him. But he was on the cutting edge, and it wasn't until late in the century, probably 1990 or so, that scientists actually got together and realized that what he discovered was very, very, very important, and they named it the Warburg effect. And we all study that now. His student was Hans Krebs, and if you've ever taken any biochemistry, you know about the Krebs cycle. So this guy taught the man who taught us about the Krebs cycle. So very important person, and he had a lot of money, and he had a lot of backing from the government. But who is out there who wants to back horse science that doesn't have an agenda, such as a feed company or supplement company or a pharmaceutical company? I've got another thing to say about pharmaceutical companies in another podcast that is just, it just makes you question what's going on. So as I've said before, the best pain a horse can have is no pain at all. So preventing pain is the best thing. And the best thing we do to prevent arthritis in horses and breakdown of horses is to feed them correctly. And once you feed them correctly, you could prevent a lot of these breakdowns that they have. And therefore you aren't going to need as much Equioxx or Banamine. As far as laryngeal problems in horses, they're usually in rapidly growing long-necked horses, such as thoroughbreds. So if we let them grow at a more normal rate, has anybody studied that to see if that actually causes laryngeal hemiplegia or roaring in horses? And of course, CBD is all the rage now because everybody wants to be pain-free in their life. So they're chewing their gummies that have CBD in it, and they're thinking that they're feeling better. I know plenty of people personally who swear by taking CBD, and it seems to decrease their pain in their joints. And of course, the cynical person inside of me says, well, why don't you try these gummy bears? We have green ones and we have red ones. And one of them has it and one of them doesn't, and see if we can tell which one has it, which one doesn't, and see if we can do some sort of study where I took a green one, I didn't get any effect, but I took a red one and oh my gosh, I felt so much better. You know, it's just, there's so much science that has to be done, and there's so much that can go wrong. And that's me being cynical. All right, so this is a short podcast. Thank you for spending your time with me.
Hey everyone, Doc T here. Thank you for listening to my content. Would you do me a huge favor? Would you please subscribe, comment, like, thumbs up, and give a star review? However it's presented to you, I want you to do that. There's two reasons. The first, of course, is to improve this product. This way I know what you like, what you don't like, what I can improve upon, what topics you want me to cover. But more importantly, it's also going to help others find me. And by doing that, you are now engaged in this mission of helping horses thrive in a human world. By you helping, we can reach others. And that I would be so grateful for. And remember, go to thehorsesadvocate.com for updates on this information. Thehorsesadvocate.com. And again, thank you so much for being here. Doc T out.